Good morning to all of you who are connected with us today. It's a pleasure to have you join us today for our third day of the 11th Congress on Augustinian Studies. In this opportunity, we are going to welcome Professor Anthony Dupont, who is going to be talking about the influence of honesty, humility, and hospitality in a world that is currently on crisis. In the previous days, we have been reflecting on topics such as migrations, the importance of truth, and just a few minutes ago about the importance of different values for the construction of a peaceful society. In this opportunity, we will continue with Professor Dupont. He's going to make some insights on the values I just mentioned for better constructing a world that is currently in crisis. So Professor Dupont holds 3 master's degrees from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and his research interests is focused on Christian antiquity and Augustinian studies. Professor Dupont also makes part of the editorial committee of Augustiniana Revista Académica and Humanitas Audi, which are publications from the Augustinian University in Colombia. Professor Dupont, we're very glad you could have joined us today. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today, and please welcome.
Good morning, Uni Augustiniana. Good morning, Bogota. Good afternoon or good evening for those joining us from other parts of the world. It's a great joy to reconnect with friends and colleagues at Uni Augustiniana during this splendidly organized conference. I'm grateful for all the good work of Uni Augustiniana and the conference organizers. It is a pleasure and honor to participate. Augustinian leadership in a world in crisis, a plea to rediscover the virtues of honesty, humility, and hospitality. What is the relevance of Augustine of Hippo in our world today? How can he inspire our leaders in a period of economic instability, political upheaval, religious conflict, and worldwide pandemic? How can he instruct all of us to become leaders in the concrete society we live in? At first sight, his theological treatises from 16 centuries ago do not seem fit to answer these questions. Augustine lived in another period, he does not know our world, and he is rather a theoretical scholar, it seems. 3 preliminary considerations show that Augustine could, however, provide inspiring answers. First of all, Augustine was not only an abstract theologian. Thanks to many personal information in his books, we know him as a very tangible person. He could be hot or cold, he could be ill, suffer from his lungs or from a headache. He could be tired, angry and sad, or happy and glad. He could fall in love and feel the keen pangs of love. He could sin. All this he describes in his own words. He does not put himself on a pedestal. On the contrary, we get to know him as a human being made of flesh and blood. What is more, he indicates himself that it is this concrete man influenced by day-to-day events who practices theology. Moreover, the Roman Empire in the days of Augustine was in a profound crisis. It was characterized by economic depression, exponential rates of taxes, corrupt and malfunctioning bureaucracy, the loss of national unity, citizens not trusting their political leaders anymore. In 410, Rome, the symbolic capital of the Roman Empire, was invaded. The sack of Rome can be compared with 9/11, the feeling of the end of an era, the sudden loss of all certainties. That fall of Rome provoked a huge flood of refugees. Many boats of refugees arrived in Augustine's Hippo. The time in which Augustine lived was also on a religious level very turbulent. It was, for instance, typified by religious fundamentalism. Think of the Donatist violent excesses in Augustine's North Africa. Virulent religious conflicts, for instance with the Manichaeans and the Arians, and discussions about doctrine and ecclesial authority. The Pelagian controversy comes to mind. Though 16th century separate us from Augustine, the time in which he lived resembles our contemporary context rather well. Thirdly, Augustine assumed many leadership roles. He is often described as monk, bishop, and theologian. He lived in a religious community that he founded himself. For this community, he had written a rule. Augustine was bishop of the city of Hippo. He took his personal responsibility as a bishop very seriously. In addition to instructing his flock in the Christian faith and life, he took care of their concrete daily needs. He also acted according to Roman law as a civic judge in Hippo, settling many disputes. Finally, he was also a very active thinker and writer, writing many theological treatises, which were often response to the theological discussions and religious controversies he mentioned just ago. Hence, Augustine was an active and committed leader as a superior of his community, as pastor of his diocese, and yes, even as a theologian. His own personal example and the enduring legacy of his ideas provide ample inspiration for current leaders, for all of us. We will focus this inspiration on a triple H: honesty, humility, hospitality. The honest Augustine, the first H, honesty. How honest was Augustine? This is not an easy question to place over an author who could be such an incisive theoretician of human traits on the one hand, yet who on the other hand was so very open, so very willingly confessional with regard to the complex place of his own emotions and the practice of his concrete life. In what follows, we will first consider Augustine's reflections about the opposite of truth, honesty, namely lying. Subsequently, we will explore his confessions to unravel his personal experience of honesty, which will result thirdly in reflection about the tears of Augustine. Rejection of lies. Augustine develops his theoretical aversion to dishonesty in the tractates on lying and against lying, in which he condemns every form of lying. He rebukes even a small lie, since he asserts that by definition an innocent or harmless lie never exists. Lying is a deliberate choice to not be honest, and thus it automatically implies a rupture with your fellow man and above all with God. Lying makes every relation with God, whom is the truth, impossible. If you think it's better to lie to a person because you fear the truth would harm him, you nevertheless harm this person because you alienate him from reality, you deform his reality. In his book, The City of God, Augustine therefore recommends, tell the truth, even when it hurts. Augustine pleads to be truthful and authentic, always, everywhere, in all circumstances. In his own life, Augustine certainly tried to live according to this standard. However, in one notable application of it, it seems that it was hard for him to be completely honest, or at least to give an unbiased account of affairs. This was whenever he found himself engaged in theological controversies, in particular those with the Manichaeans, the Donatists, and Pelagians. Augustine took the active choice of presenting the ideas of his opponents in a tactical way. Augustine would go so far sometimes as to exaggerate the flaws, or we should say what he considered to be the flaws, in the arguments of his adversaries in order to be able to disregard them more summarily or dramatically. His prerogative was to be able to present them to his audience as plainly heterodox, and to that end he could have no time for shades of grey. To his mind, the Catholic Church was the locus veritatis, the place of truth, and his principal task as a bishop was that of keeping his flock walking swiftly and strongly in that truth. In relation to that, he felt perfectly justified in adopting this somewhat mercenary attitude. If you wish to stand a more personal example against this, the anecdote he describes at Confessions 5 comes immediately to mind. As a young professor in Carthage, Augustine intended to move to Rome to rise on the academic ladder. However, he did not want to take his mother Monica, an often domineering woman, with him. So he lied to her, telling her that he would spend the evening with a good friend. Moreover, he convinced her to pray in a chapel dedicated to Saint Cyprian, precisely so that during her nocturnal vigil he would have his chance to sneak away, secretly and mendaciously. But the story does not end there. He later bitterly regretted having deceived his mother. He will beat his breast and choose to admit his dishonesty in his confessions, for everybody to read. Personal discovery of honesty. Inflamed by reading Cicero's Hortensius, the young Augustine sought eagerly for happiness in truth. His confessions can be understood as his quest for truth on a personal, existential, and metaphysical level. Once he had found that truth in Christianity, he was now able to translate that theoretical truth into the praxis of his own life by embracing continence. Honesty became the backbone of his thought and action. For example, upon resigning as imperial orator in the wake of his conversion, he would make no bones about citing his newfound disgust for that old troll's litany of flattery and lies. When we read his earliest philosophical works, we see that the truth of Christianity was the force that appealed him the most to this vera philosophia, through philosophy. In early treatises, he describes God and Christ as a guarantee of truth being through themselves, not merely on an epistemological level, but also metaphysically and existentially. These philosophical reflections on epistemological truth will eventually come to truth in his world-famous autobiography, The Confessions, the truth about how Augustine found truth. The Confessions are an honest attempt to give a truthful account of his inner life. Augustine confesses his own mischiefs and sings praise to God. The fact that Augustine admits his errors in front of God guarantees the honesty of his confession. Augustine repeatedly stresses that God knows his most intimate thoughts, so why even try to hide or gloss them? Furthermore, Augustine makes it his business to explain to all his readers that each convert's return to God coincides with the return to oneself. Rediscovering God in one's heart means or is even preceded by looking oneself in the eyes. And because one is now stripped of every facade, this confrontation with oneself can be a painful one. Augustine formulates this very strongly. You took me up from behind my own back, where I had placed myself because I did not wish to observe myself. And you set me before my face, so that I should see how vile I was, how twisted and filthy, covered in sores and ulcers. And I looked and I was appalled, but there was no way of escaping from myself. Augustine was anything but an abstract theologian. His theology was based on experience. He shows, by means of always linking his theological thinking to his personal story, that theology is not something abstract, but embedded in a theologian's personal life and in historical events. On this view, Augustine is constantly admitting to the contextual framework of his doctrinal thinking and calling it honesty to do so. In later life, he will come to appreciate how his thinking underwent an evolution and how many of his ideas were developed in discussions with his opponents. He will readily admit that as a young theologian, he did not think in the same way that he did as an older and more experienced bishop. Finally, he would formalize this self-criticism in a work called Reconsiderations, which he would write near the end of his life. In it, he would survey, chronologically and methodologically, the totality of his writings, noting, correcting, and explaining any mistakes he believed himself to have made. Additionally, he would leave the door open in what can strike many as a surprising move for a defensor fidei, a defender of the faith. He would expressly invite his future readers to upgrade and correct his thinking if on any point they found it to be contrary to the truth. By doing this, he made his conception of the truth inseparable from his conception of the human condition, source of error, and grace, source of truth. As he would put it in another little work at the end of his life, and yet I would not want anyone to embrace all my views in order to be my follower, but only those points on which he sees that I'm not mistaken. I have not always held the same views. Rather, I think that as I wrote, I made progress by the mercy of God, but not that I have started off with perfection. We can, of course, have good hope for someone if the last day of this life finds him making progress. Augustine's tears. The burning heart pierced with an arrow, but not that is the most famous iconographical symbol associated with Augustine. Given Augustine's fundamental honesty, we would plead now to rediscover another iconographical tradition, Augustine's tears. For example, artists depicted him crying under an olive tree at the moment of his conversion in a Milanese garden in 386. Or almost 35 years later, crying on his deathbed, contemplating the life he has lived. Gisèle Mathieu Castellani wrote a decade ago a somewhat neglected but interesting booklet entitled Les larmes d'Augustin, the Tears of Augustine. She writes about the music, the poetry of Augustine's tears. Each important moment of Augustine's life is accompanied by tears. We read, for instance, in the Confessions about his tears when he was punished as a child, when he mourned about the death of a close friend, when his heart was broken when he sent away his girlfriend, when his beloved mother Monica passed away. We also remember the tears Monica shed for the turbulent young Augustine, and those he himself shed when he was in a depressive state and mental deadlock in Milan prior to his conversion. In other parts of his oeuvre, we find testimony of his tears. For instance, when his young son Adeodatus died much too early, when his friend Marcellinus was unjustly decapitated, and when the Donatist controversy turned into a bloody civil war. We can also imagine that the pastor Augustine shared the grief and the tears of his congregants when he ministered to sick at their sickbed, when he visited parishioners who were imprisoned because they could not pay their heavy taxes, when parents rushed to church to get their dying baby baptized. More than a mere cadence or rhythm in his life, Augustine's tears reveal a true ethic of tears. His tears teach him every time what is really important in life, what choices to make, what path to take. At the same time, they teach an authentic love of tears. His tears teach him to distinguish his superficial and fleeting passions from fundamental love. Not wealth, power, ambition, or sex, but true love for God and his fellows proves able to make him happy. He learns that lesson through his tears. That is why Augustine's tears are therapeutic. they heal his soul. Augustine's tears resemble the water of the baptismal font. Each time they cleanse Augustine's thoughts, they convert his aspirations, they renew his actions. Augustine's tears are an antidote to any form of pride or arrogance. They express a fundamental humility, a virtue we will now turn to. And the tears express that Augustine shies from any form of dishonesty about himself, that he accepts the truth about himself. And in this moment, in this movement of truthful introspection, embraces the comfort of God's divine truth. Augustine's tears taught him to understand humility. This humility eventually is the foundation of his honesty. The forgotten virtue of humility. In a recent book entitled On the Road with St. Augustine, philosopher and theologian James Smith advocates walking with Augustine because, according to Smith, Augustine teaches that the way itself is life and that we are that way, hence the title of his book. Today, I would like to answer with you that invitation from James Smith to set out with Augustine. The compass that Augustine recommends as an apt guide to our journey is the compass of humility. Humility seems at first sight to be an old-fashioned term, utterly outdated for modern, independent and self-conscious people. When we carefully examine this concept with Augustine, we notice that humility is anything but outdated. And perhaps the compass that we all, as individuals and as society often adrift, need, a compass that we really need. Our humble journey with Augustine as guide consists of 3 stages. Humility as an essential doctrine in Augustine's thinking, Augustine's personal discovery of humility, and Augustinian humility for contemporary people. Augustine's doctrine of humility. Humility stands center stage in the gospel. Christ came to serve, not to be served. Those who are humble of heart are praised in the Sermon on the Mount and in the Magnificat. Augustine held these pericopes close to his heart. He was especially impressed by the prologue of John and the central dogmatic position of Christianity it expresses. Verbum caro factum, the word became flesh. The dogma of incarnation, God becoming human, Christ assuming a mortal body, is, according to Augustine, essentially the dogma of humility. This insight grew thanks to his philosophical training. The philosophers, Neoplatonists in particular, rejected the notion of incarnation. They deemed the divine and the human as completely opposite. Hence, they argued, the divine cannot become human, and as such, they considered the notion of incarnation as a contradiction in terms. In his Confessions, Augustine clearly underlines that at the moment he understood that incarnation does not imply such a contradiction in terms, but on the contrary is the ultimate seal of God's divinity and God's relation to mankind, only at that moment he could convert to Christianity. At that moment he realized that only a God who becomes human in Christ, who wants to become incarnate, can truly relate to humanity. That God who is completely transcendent paradoxically becomes immanent, that the heavenly embraces the earth, that the creator takes on the creation, Augustine perceives as a fundamental act of humility. For that reason, Augustine considers humility as the most important divine attribute, the highest name of God. Augustine considered humility as the queen of Christian virtues. Humility, however, was for Augustine not only an ethical category, he perceived it as a theological paradigm. Augustine sees pride as the root of all sin in the world. More specifically, this pride defines the so-called original sin, that is the sin the first couple committed in Eden and in which Augustine believes the whole of mankind participates. This first sin, or the sin of pride, in a nutshell, is the desire to become like God. In other words, pride is the illusion that we as humans do not need the help of someone else, of God. That we can reach happiness in our lives completely on our own. Such autonomy or autarky, Augustine believes, does not bring real happiness, but on the contrary, encloses and entraps humanity in an unhappy state of arrogance, destroying any genuine relationships with God and with our fellow humans. Humility is required to be able to open oneself up to others, because with someone who is proud, everything revolves around self, asserts Tax van Bavel in the line of Augustine. Once pride entered the world after the first sin of humankind, however, this pride dominates the world. We humans cannot but experience our world and our life within this hermeneutic of pride. We think our identity is built only on what we achieve in this world, materially, professionally, sportively, Augustine preaches. In order to break open this hermeneutic of pride, we need help from outside. We cannot achieve this on our own. This is exactly what the incarnation entails. God opposes mankind's pride with divine humility. Christ's humble incarnation dissolves Adam's proud fall in paradise. De Doctrina Christiana, Augustine's handbook on biblical exegesis, describes that we needed the divine hermeneutic of humility, God's self-chosen humiliation, to alter our thinking, feeling, longing, which were all oriented towards pride. Hence, in one word, divine grace is Christ's humility. This may be an experience we all share. Just think of the fairy tale of the emperor's new clothes. We all are actually small emperors, but we do not realize this ourselves until a little boy honestly exclaims, "You are naked." Take the example of doctors and nurses, especially during the corona crisis now. Volunteers who serve soup to the poor and the homeless, people who visit the lonely and elderly at home, young people who go to camp with poor children or help them with their homework. There are numerous examples that make it clear that an amazing career, a series of honorary titles, an expensive company car, an exclusive holiday, or an exquisite wine cellar are ultimately relative and are certainly no alternatives to true happiness. In Sermon 188, Augustine contrasts the humility of Christ's incarnation with the pride of Adam. It is not a coincidence this sermon was preached on the feast of Christmas, the celebration of Christ's incarnation, according to Augustine, the high feast of humility. He exclaims in that sermon that human pride presses us down, and only divine humility can lift us up again. The image is not in itself simple to understand, but once it is understood, it's very evocative. Pride, which humans think causes them to move upwards, in fact causes them to move downwards. Human pride weighs humans down and presses them to the ground. Only divine humility, manifested in the descending movement that God effects by being born as a human, can set humans free from their encumbered condition. Once this has happened, humans can join God in making a truly ascending movement. For Augustine, the incarnation of Christ, God who chooses to become human, is a strong expression of Christ's fundamental humility. This humility of Christ, however, did not cease with being born as a vulnerable baby in the stable of Bethlehem, Augustine argues, but culminates in Christ's total obedience and complete humility on the cross at Golgotha. Precisely at the mortal cross, Christ teaches us humility. In his homilies, Augustine compares Christ to a doctor coming to earth to heal humankind, which is, in Augustine's mind, one sick patient. Humankind suffers from the tumor of pride. Christ offers the medicine of humility, which is a painful medicine, like a bitter syrup or even the amputation of a limb. In order to persuade the patient to take the medicine, the doctor takes it himself. As an example, though of course the doctor himself does not need to take the medicine. What a strong image, the doctor who swallows the bitter syrup himself. This image also teaches us that Christ is not a sadist in this respect. Humility is not intended as a humiliation to keep us down, but on the contrary, to heal us, to make us strong and powerful, to make us grow into the greatness for which God originally created us. Bernard Brüning wrote, "Those who imitate the teacher of humility act in service to the others. The members of Christ's body become each other's servants." Thus, humility is not only an inner condition, it is also an active service. Heart and hands are humbled together. And this is how a happy and peaceful human community is established. Augustine's personal experiences. As Augustine himself is an incarnated theologian, he applies what he believes and preaches on his own life. We see humility as an important element in his biography and personal spirituality. In the rule he composed for his community, in his many personal letters and sermons, we see traces of Augustine's own humility. He, for instance, famously refused to wear a silk shirt which rich members of his congregation offered him. They wanted their bishop to be dressed according to his rank. Augustine narrates, "I'm offered, for example, a very expensive cloak. Perhaps it would be suitable for a bishop to wear it, although it's not suitable for Augustine to do so, that is to say, a poor man born of poor parents. Now people are going to say that I wear expensive clothes, which I couldn't have had either in my father's house or in my old secular profession." In another sermon, preached at the occasion of the ordination of a bishop, Augustine gives good counsel to his junior colleague. He warns against the danger of pride and calls for the imitation of Christ's humility. He stresses that the desire to become a bishop should be the desire to do good works, not the desire to receive the honor of this office. In itself, Augustine therefore has no problems with a good salary, with holding an important office, with obtaining a diploma, with winning a marathon. Humility is no obstacle to such healthy ambitions. He does, however, warn that they should not become an end in themselves, but should always be framed within an authentically lived humility. Even as a bishop, Augustine continues to emphasize that he is a poor sinner, not out of a pathological desire to wallow in his sins. What he wants to indicate by saying that he remains, even as a bishop, a poor sinner all the time, is that he always needs the help of others and the other to live happily. That confession, that intuition is the core and charisma of humility. The contemporary message of humility. The lesson Augustine intends to teach us is clear. Be humble, admit you are human, admit you are a sinner. He writes to Dioscorus that all our actions, thoughts and words should be directed by humility, humility alone. It would be a good suggestion for a new hymn of These. Augustine, starting his series of sermons on the first epistle of John, exclaims, Ubi humilitas, ibi caritas. Where humility resides, there love lives. Humility is a synonym for love in Augustine's mindset. There is no love without openness and receptivity. Where humility reigns, there is love. Humility is the fertile ground on which love can flourish. Love always presupposes someone's ability to transcend self-centeredness and to go out to others. Without humility breaking open the walls of the self-locked self, that is impossible. It is no coincidence that Augustine sees in love and humility the basis of a good community. Allow me to finish our humility journey with the final metaphor of Augustine. The coot, a medium-sized water bird, does not have its nest in height. Nothing is stronger and yet more humble than a coot's nest. Although Augustine was a theologian, not an ornithologist, he had observed that coots, unlike other birds, do not build their nests in trees or gutters, but on the ground at the waterfront. Yet they are very sturdy nests, Augustine notes. Not in height, symbol of pride, but firmly on the ground, symbol of humility. Coots build their nest, and that nest is very strong. In that solid nest of humility, we are hatched as eggs, as individuals. We form community with each other, and we learn to flee to the wide world. Although Augustine is traditionally known as Dr. Gratiae, teacher of grace, we can today conclude he is also Dr. Humilitatis, teacher of humility. The grace we receive from God is the lesson of humility. And humility is not a curtailing humiliation, but a call and invitation to blossom into happy people and a harmonious community. Augustine, our adept guide, taught us that humility is the compass of choice for walking our path of life. More than a mere navigational tool, humility is the way itself. Christ, after John 14:6, the way, the truth, and the life, is essentially himself humility. In the footsteps of Christ, Augustine invites us to follow that path of humility, to discover the humble truth of our true identity, to fully embody that service of community life over and over again. This aspect of community service links humility with hospitality, our third H. The three dimensions of hospitality. In his sermons, Augustine frequently dealt with the issue of hospitality, which was very important for him. Guests were always welcome in Hippo. Today, in a world where pandemics, famines, wars and oppression are unfortunately not absent, and when in our own environment the group of people in need of care is dramatically growing, hospitality is a task for every person. Augustine uses three biblical images to speak of hospitality: John the Baptist, Martha, Lazarus' sister, and the supper at Emmaus. Each of these images expresses a dimension of hospitality, three dimensions that are intrinsically linked. First, John the Baptist, listening hospitality. John the Baptist indicates the first dimension of hospitality, listening. Augustine describes that John the Baptist really did not want to hear his own voice, but only Christ. That Christ was the word and John only wanted to be the ears to hear that word. Augustine also says a number of similar things in his own sermons. Whoever only wants to listen to himself will constantly fall and can only get up again by listening to others. One who wants to be heard by God must first learn to listen to God. Hospitality is in the first instance listening to our fellow human beings, being available to the other in silence without immediately wanting to give a response, being there listening, opening space for the other. This may seem simple and easy, but this is not a task to be underestimated. Listening to the other's story in all openness, listening to the other in its otherness, implies that we put our own story in parentheses and renounce our own thinking patterns, expectations, and assumptions. By listening to the other, we allow the other to live. Moreover, by listening to the other ensures that we can live ourselves. Listening to the other is not just about receiving information, but it has a profound impact on our own lives. Augustine preaches that listening should not only be done with the ears, but especially with the heart. The words of the other must also penetrate our hearts through the ears, he preaches in Sermon 249. Thus, listening hospitality is not without consequences. It changes and transforms us. Augustine himself expressed it as follows: whoever stops listening to others and only listens to himself falls. By really listening to the other, we come to the realization that we cannot live alone, that we are who we are thanks to the people around us. The French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas stated that man is only himself through the other person, by listening to the fellow human being who speaks to me. The Dutch Augustinian theologian Martin Schramer sums it up as follows: not to grant hospitality is to refuse to be human with your fellow human beings. As a pastor, as a religious superior, as a civil judge, Augustine was constantly listening to his fellow man. In one of his sermons, he confesses that he himself would rather listen to the word of God rather than to have to preach about it. It is only when Augustine dares to listen openly to God's word, without speaking as an intellectual thinker himself at that moment, that Augustine receives the strength to convert to Christianity, as we read in the famous conversion scene of Confessions 8. The moment Augustine, who is trained as an orator and who was known as an enthusiastic speaker, dares for the first time to be silent and to listen to the other, to God, his life changes in a drastic way. Martha, active commitment. Mary, the sister of Lazarus, who sat listening at the feet of Jesus, is another biblical example of the listening hospitality, which, by the way, immediately takes us to the second dimension of hospitality, to Martha, the other sister of Lazarus. Martha is a model for a helpful and active hospitality. After all, listening hospitality must not remain merely passive and receptive, but must be made concrete in deeds and actions. Martha and Mary are not understood by Augustine as a contradiction, but as two complementary models, where Martha represents the active life, the earthly life, and Mary the contemplative life, the heavenly life. Augustine insists that one form of life is no better than another, but that they are equal and that they are ultimately aimed at one and the same goal, the true happiness of man. With the image of Martha's hospitality, Augustine points out that Christians should not remain seated on an ivory tower, but must be active in the world, taking care of their fellow man in a concrete way wherever necessary. In his sermons on the Gospel of John, Augustine calls on all people to become a source for their fellow man in a concrete way, to put up their sleeves and actually help people. As a bishop, Augustine himself also showed tireless care for anyone who needed help. He sold his church's liturgical vessels to buy food in the event of famine in Hippo. He helped people to pay their loans. He visited the sick. The concrete care for the fellow man is a concern for the whole person, body and mind. After all, caring for a fellow human being includes alleviating his physical needs as well as taking care of his psychological and spiritual happiness. In this way, the listening hospitality and the concretely helping hospitality are intimately linked. Disciples on the road to Emmaus, an openness to transcendence. Not everyone can be helped, however. The needs of our fellow human beings can sometimes transcend both our listening ear and our helping hands. People who are very sad, deeply depressed, seriously ill. In short, there is also a certain acceptance in hospitality that some problems transcend us. Hospitality is in this respect knowing that our hospitality does not solve everything, but still remain fully committed to this hospitality. This is perhaps the most difficult dimension of hospitality, and Augustine is fully aware of this difficulty. One of the focal points of his theology is his understanding that man is ultimately a limited being. Despite of humanity's efforts to do the right thing, things often go wrong in life. Failure and shortcomings are a part of human life. That is why man is in constant need of God's mercy, what Augustine refers to by the term grace. The postmodern philosopher Jacques Derrida, in his famous commentary on Augustine's Confessions entitled Circumfession, distinguishes hospitality of invitation from hospitality of visitation, and the latter concept he borrowed from the already mentioned Emmanuel Levinas. Hospitality of invitation. When we invite someone, we remain the master of our house. Mi casa es tu casa, we say, but we expect our guests respect our house, our rules, our language. Otherwise put, hospitality under certain conditions. Hospitality of visitation is an other reality, an unexpected visitor, a visit that falls upon us, an intrusion, an eruption, breaking open our conditions. Let's think of the parable of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke. Unexpectedly, the traveling Samaritan finds a robbed, almost beaten to death victim alongside the road. An absolute call to the Samaritan, who immediately and radically changes his travel plans. The transcendent aspect of hospitality, the preacher Augustine masterfully describes in the example of the two disciples on their journey to Emmaus. Two disciples leave Jerusalem after the crucifixion of Christ. They are deeply unhappy and depressed. They have lost hope. Their faith in Christ has died, it seems. On their way to Emmaus, the two meet a stranger and they offer him hospitality. They listen to what he has to say, they offer him company and a meal. And now, according to Augustine, the story turns around in a wonderful way. The two disciples offered hospitality to Christ, whom they did not recognize. At the table, Christ takes bread and breaks it, they recognize him, and the guest wonderfully becomes the host, who takes away their grief and despair. In short, in the hospitality we offer our neighbors, we meet Christ. Christ who himself said, "All that you have done for the least of mine, you have done for me." The Augustine connoisseur and Augustinian friar Tars van Bavel wrote, "For Augustine, Christ is always we. He is we and we are him. But it is important to continue to see this unity see actively and dynamically. We are only one in Christ if we love what he loved, and if we are willing to live in the same poverty and humility as he does. Christ has taken upon himself our human need, wherein is toil, fear, and sadness. That is how he still dies in us. But by virtue of that same unity, we have been resurrected in him, and there is hope in the world. The life of Augustine himself testifies that listening to the other, to God, is not without surprises and leads to unexpected paths. When he converted to Christianity, he initially thought he could spend his life as a Christian intellectual, isolated from the outside world, in peace and quietness, to think and write about Christian teaching. But nothing could be further from the truth. Listening to the other, to God, makes him a committed leader with many pastoral tasks and concrete responsibilities for his community. Finally, Augustine calls on all of us to be hospitable hosts and reminds us that we are all at the same time guests in different ways in need of hospitable hosts. Martin Schramer writes the following: the practice of hospitality is not considered a work of mercy, but stems from the view that all people on earth are on the move and thus form one large community. In short, hospitality is listening, acting, opening oneself to the transcendent. In hospitality, we give our fellow humans and ourselves the opportunity to live authentically. That is, we meet Christ in our fellow humans and in ourselves. The triptych of honesty, humility, and hospitality in a world of crisis. And I think these three virtues are strongly expressed in this beautiful statue crafted by Lorenzo Quinn. Humble and honest introspection, hospitably carried in God's hand. Like a skillfully cut gem, the person, Augustine of Hippo, has many facets. Whenever such a gem, a diamond, is viewed from different angles, it sparkles in different ways. That certainly applies to Augustine. Some of the facets that might make him shine are his search for truth, his passionate conversion story, his theological writings describing God's grace, his calling as a religious and as a superior of the community he founded, his commitment as a pastor. In all these roles, we observed Augustine assuming leadership, and more in particular, he intended to be a leader by providing a good example, leading by example. Augustine also shows that though we are not all managers, school directors, politicians, we all have the crucial task to become leaders of our own lives, more in particular of the time we live in. We will come back to this point in a minute. We observed Augustine as a political leader, and not a naive one at that, and as a pastor taking care of the daily needs of his flock. He continually urges his parishioners to live exemplary lives, while Augustine himself attempted to become a leader of his own life, as we read in the Confessions. The latter Augustine achieved by deciding that the circumstances of his life do not dictate the course of his life, but that he is always in charge of his life, regardless of those circumstances. This is precisely the advice he offered from his pulpit when people were trying to understand the worldwide disaster symbolized by the fall of Rome, when Hippo was flooded with refugees. Nos sumus tempora. We are the times. When his parishioners complained they were living in a terrible era, a time of worldwide calamities, Augustine answers, the times are bad, the times are hard. That is what people say. If we live in a good way, the times will be good. We are the times. As we are, the times are. It is bad people that make the world bad. Augustine's conclusion is thus straightforward. Not the historical circumstances constitute the goodness or badness of a certain time, but the way people cope with it. Concretely, Augustine tells his parishioners that it is indeed sad that many people have to flee their homes and arrive as poor refugees in Hippo. But that circumstance does not make that time itself bad. Augustine believes his parishioners can transform it in a good time by welcoming those refugees in a hospitable way. We constructed our lecture around the triple H of honesty, humility, and hospitality. This triple H fundamentally resembles the triptych of the Jesus mystery: his life, death, and resurrection, three intrinsically interwoven manifestations of the one Christ. The way in which Christ lived, his words, his actions, unavoidably resulted in his death on the cross. As his liberating actions and message during his earthly life already indicated, however, this death is not the end, for it leads to his and indeed our own resurrection. The same is true for our triple H of today: life. All what we do in life needs to be based on honesty, humility, hospitality. This is not an easy assignment. Sometimes we have a proud image of ourselves. This arrogant image needs to die. Hospitality sometimes requires sacrifices, a reshuffling of our priorities. Resurrection. Honesty, humility, and hospitality, though frequently very hard, makes us discover our true life. We find our true, honest self. We discover the humble Christ at the core of our existence. We meet God in our guests. And the double hinge that connects the icons of life, death, and resurrection is love. The double love commandment to love God and mankind. In another sermon, quite poetically, Augustine exclaims, "Amandi Deum modus est sine modo." The measure of loving God is without measure. For Augustine, it is very clear. Love is a synonym for the Holy Spirit, the source of all love, of all wisdom, of all inspiration. Thus, inspired leadership is loving leadership. This brings us to a final quote from Augustine's sermons. Dilegi et quotvis fac. Love and then do whatever you want to do. When you truly love, when you are inspired by honesty, humility, and hospitality, then you act as an inspired leader in the world we live in today, a leader of your own life. Thank you very much.
Professor Dupont, thank you very much for sharing this important message. Personally, I liked a lot what you said about we as humans make part of a large community. So we need to promote humility and hospitality just beyond charity and try to look for the common good for all the people in the world. Thank you very much. Your message was really clear, and I think it invites us to rethink about these values in a current world that is facing crisis in different dimensions: economic crisis, political crisis, social crisis, and just recently a kind of world health crisis. So I would like to continue. We've got some questions on our chat or some people who have been listening to your presentation. I did want to ask something for you to answer. Professor Juliana Liloy Valencia from Augustinian University, she says, in some academic environments and from contemporary philosophical currents, it is believed that medieval thought should not be present in the education of university students. She sets as an example the thoughts by St. Augustine and St. Thomas, and she wants to know, what do you think about this situation?
an answer that at the same time is honest, humble, and hospitable, I would respectfully or even disrespectfully disagree with such a wrong notion. Augustine, Thomas, Bonaventure, the Bible, the message of Christ, I think is very relevant for the society we live in today, and also for, I would say, the academic curriculum of universities and schools for higher education today. Granted, in the case of Augustine, there is a difference of 16 centuries, and Augustine lived in another world, and he does not share all the sensitivities we share today. We have to be aware of that. Studying a figure of Augustine is situating him within his historical context, finding inspiration in him, but that doesn't mean that we have to accept everything what he has said. For instance, he accepted the existence of slavery, that women should not have a role in society. So that are things we should not copy. We have to read Augustine respectfully, but at the same time critically. But when we do that, we see that Augustine, Thomas, Henri de Lubac, Henry Newman, we still read them today because they still can inspire us today. So we read them loyally and critically.
Thank you very much, Professor. We've got another question from Fiyin Ebenezer. He wants to know, how's the Augustinian community expressing love in these trying times?
The notion Augustine uses in his rule to talk about community life is an image he found in the book of Acts, an image that described the first community of Christians in Jerusalem, in Latin, cor unum, one heart, being one of heart. Meaning accepting each other's differences, trying to, in dialogue, construct genuine community in harmony, a harmony of heart. This does not mean that the other has to do or think what I think. We should not fuse into one monolithic whole. There is diversity, but as I talked about, hospitality, humility, honesty, accepting yourself as you are, looking yourself into the eyes. Well, that's an exercise you also have to do with other people around you. When you do that, honestly, humbly, in a hospitable way, you create in a certain way a unity of the heart. And I know in Spanish and Latin America, the heart is a very powerful image. Well, that's why the heart became a symbol of Augustine, and that is what he's saying to us today. You have to form unity with your brains evidently, but unity in society, community life is about the heart, love.
Thanks a lot, Professor. So we've have one last question from our editorial coordinator at Agustiniana, Ruth Kwasialput. She wants to know how to promote humility in a world where humans take everything they need without thinking about the others or our own planet.
Yes, that's a very pertinent question, a very difficult question, because we live in a material world, and it's all about a good salary, having money to travel, to buy a nice iPhone. And as such, Augustine is not against that. But promoting humility, I would say, and that is also Augustine's message, the only way to promote or stimulate that is by giving the example yourself. preacher, live what you preach. If we study Augustine, we have to, embrace that humility. And mind you, humility does not want to imply you have to dress poorly. You are not allowed to study or to get the highest degree, that you cannot compete in a football game and you really want to win the match, or you want your club to win the championship. That's all okay for Augustine, but it's the way in which you cope with it. It should not be an end as such. An image Augustine uses, it may not become an idol, but something that really makes you happy. Otherwise, you run the risk that you become addicted to it. If you more money, a more expensive iPhone. I have to travel. New York is not far enough. No, I have to do London. And does that really make you happy? And that way you are, kind of enslaved by it. And perhaps, and I definitely do not want to say that Corona is something good, not at all. But perhaps a positive side of the whole negative catastrophe is we have to learn priorities. For instance, traveling here at home was exploring our garden again. And we live in a city, so a very small garden, but it's a small paradise, which we neglected for years, and we have it over here. So humility is, to put it plainly, to be happy with what you have, to be happy with who you are, and especially to be happy with the people you live with, your family, your friends. That's happiness, and that's at the same time humility.
Dr. Dupont, thank you very much for these inspiring messages. We hope our audience and ourselves get a big part of what you have taught us today, what you have been talking to us today, and also on Augustinian thought, and make it part of our lives to become more humble, to become more hospitable, and try to strive helping others. We appreciate your participation in this event. Hope to have you probably next year in Colombia after all of this situation is overcome. And we appreciate your cooperation during this event.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You have a good rest of the day.
Yep, you too. Goodbye.
Goodbye. For the rest of our audience, we kindly appreciate your participation during this conference. We hope you connect with us tomorrow for our two last conferences on this event. The first of them to be held at 9 a.m. It's going to approach the teachings by Laudato and how they help to face new challenges we're facing in the current world. This conference is going to be presented by Agustiniana Professor Vicente Valenzuela, 9 a.m. through our YouTube channel. And afterwards, we'll be joining Professor Paul van Gist from Tilburg University in the Netherlands, who is going to make important and interesting reflections on Augustinian thought and economics. And he will be talking about a little bit about making rational choices for our society and our environment. I give you our thanks once more and hope to connect with you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Have a good day.